The wail of police sirens pierced the quiet Sunday afternoon as Margaret Holloway stood frozen in her backyard, garden hose in hand, mouth agape. Across the fence, Diane Winters, known throughout Oak Ridge Estates as HOA Karen, stood with her arms crossed, a smug smile spreading across her face as two police cruisers pulled up to the curb. "I told you that removing that pool without proper authorization was against community guidelines," Diane called out, her voice carrying that familiar condescending lilt that had become her trademark throughout the neighborhood. "Now you'll see what happens when people don't follow the rules." Margaret couldn't believe this was happening. It was her own above-ground pool in her own backyard on her own property. How could dismantling it possibly be a police matter? Officer Jenkins approached with a confused expression. "Ma'am, we received a call about property destruction and potential community violations." Diane stepped forward, clipboard in hand, the clipboard that had become a symbol of terror for Oak Ridge residents. "Officer, I'm Diane Winters, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. This woman is dismantling a permanent structure without proper HOA approval, which violates Section 14.3 of our community bylaws." Margaret found her voice. "It's an inflatable pool I put up for my kids last summer. It's not a permanent structure. I'm taking it down because we're selling the house." "She needs written approval," Diane interrupted, flipping through her papers. "The bylaws clearly state." "The bylaws that you rewrote last month," Margaret challenged. "The ones that suddenly classified temporary summer items as permanent structures after half the neighborhood had already installed them." Officer Jenkins looked between the two women, clearly realizing he'd been called into a neighborhood dispute rather than any actual crime. His partner was talking on the radio, shaking his head. Diane's face tightened. "Rules are rules. I did make exceptions when the Johnsons wanted to paint their door navy blue instead of the approved cobalt, and I certainly won't start now." Margaret stepped closer to the fence. "This isn't about my pool, Diane. This is because I spoke up at the last HOA meeting about your husband's unauthorized shed extension." A flash of something, anger, fear, crossed Diane's face. "That's completely different. Richard chairs the architectural committee, which he appointed himself to after forcing out Mr. Grayson," Margaret countered. "Just like you've done with every committee position. Fill them with your friends while raising our HOA fees 3 times in 2 years. The second officer approached. "Ma'am, there's no crime being committed here. This is a civil matter between you and your HOA." Diane's face flushed crimson. "But the bylaws are not enforceable by police," Officer Jenkins explained patiently. "If you believe there's a violation, you'll need to pursue that through your HOA's formal channels or civil court." As the officers returned to their vehicles, Diane's phone was already at her ear. "Richard, call an emergency board meeting. We need to discuss the enforcement procedures for Section 14.3 immediately." Margaret watched her storm off, knowing this battle was far from over. In Oak Ridge Estates, crossing Diane Winters meant war, and the entire neighborhood was about to be caught in the crossfire. Word of Margaret's confrontation with Diane spread through Oak Ridge Estates like wildfire. By Monday morning, Margaret's phone buzzed constantly with text messages from neighbors expressing both support and concern. "You actually stood up to her," texted Helen from across the street. "Be careful. Last person who challenged her ended up with daily compliance inspections for 6 months." The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening in the community clubhouse. As Margaret pulled into the parking lot, she noticed it was unusually full. Residents who hadn't attended meetings in years were filing inside, murmuring in hushed tones. Diane sat at the front table, perfectly composed in a crisp blazer, shuffling papers with Richard beside her. 5 other board members, all handpicked by Diane, flanked them. The manufactured confidence in Diane's posture faltered slightly when she glanced up and saw the packed room. "Let's call this meeting to order," Diane announced, tapping her gavel with practiced authority. First item, enforcement procedures for regulation violations. Margaret took a seat in the second row next to Tom Garcia, who had received 3 violation notices for his bird feeder last month. "As many of you know," Diane continued, "we've had increasing issues with residents ignoring proper channels for property modifications. Yesterday, we even had police involvement when Mrs. Holloway decided rules don't apply to her." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Diane smiled thinly. "Therefore, the board proposes implementing a new 3-strike violation system with escalating fines starting at $250. The room erupted. Margaret stood. "Point of order. The bylaws require a community vote for any fine structure changes." Diane's smile tightened. "As president, I have emergency authority to." "You don't," interrupted Frank Miller, a retired attorney who had lived in Oak Ridge since it was built. "I've reviewed our incorporation documents. Emergency powers are limited to natural disasters and imminent structural dangers." Richard leaned toward the microphone. "This isn't open for debate. The board has decided." "The board works for us," called someone from the back, not the other way around. Diane's knuckles whitened around her gavel. "The pool issue is merely symptomatic of a larger problem. If we don't maintain standards, property values suffer." Margaret stepped forward. "This isn't about standards, Diane. It's about power. I've been talking with neighbors. You've issued 68 violation notices in 4 months, nearly all for minor issues that weren't violations under previous boards." She pulled out a folder, and curiously, none of these violations went to board members or their friends. Richard's shed still exceeds size limits by 40%. That's different," Richard sputtered. "The committee granted special dispensation due to a committee consisting of yourself, your golfing buddy, and Diane's sister," Margaret countered, opening another folder. "I also have had the financial reports from the last 3 years. Care to explain why landscaping costs tripled after your brother started a gardening company?" The room fell silent. Diane stood abruptly, knocking over her water glass. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, voice tight with fury. "We haven't voted," Frank reminded her calmly. "Then we vote now. All in favor of dismissing these ridiculous accusations." Only the board members raised their hands. All opposed. A forest of hands shot up throughout the room. Diane's face contorted with rage as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. The carefully constructed kingdom she had built was crumbling before her eyes. The morning after the contentious meeting, Diane's BMW cruised slowly down Oak Ridge Drive. She took meticulous notes on her tablet, photographing every minor infraction she could spot. A trash can left out too long, holiday lights still hanging in April, a mailbox with chipped paint. Her routine patrol had taken on new urgency. She needed to reassert control. Margaret stepped out to collect her mail just as Diane's car rolled to a stop in front of her house. The two women locked eyes through the windshield. "Documenting more violations?" Margaret called out, making air quotes. Diane emerged from her vehicle, shoulders squared. "Just performing my duties as HOA president. Someone has to maintain standards around here." Interesting timing, though. The houses you're targeting all had residents who spoke up at last night's meeting. Diane's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Pure coincidence. Though I am noticing your garden mortar stones are 3 inches higher than regulation." Margaret crossed her arms. "There is no regulation on garden mortar height." "There is now. Emergency board meeting this morning, just the executive committee. We've clarified several ambiguous sections of the landscaping code." A few neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "You can't just make up rules overnight to target specific people," Margaret said. "I'm simply protecting our community's aesthetic integrity," Diane replied, her voice carrying for the benefit of the growing audience. "Unlike some people who seem determined to turn Oak Ridge into a chaotic free-for-all." Jason Chen from 2 doors down approached, phone in hand. "Actually, Diane, I've been recording board meetings for the past year, including this morning's emergency session where you admitted, and I quote, 'We need to hit the troublemakers where it hurts.'" Color drained from Diane's face. "That's taken completely out of context." "We have a full recording," Jason replied mildly, "along with documentation of every selective enforcement instance for the past 3 years. Richard's SUV screeched to a halt behind Diane's BMW. He jumped out, waving papers. "Diane, we need to talk. Now." "I'm in the middle of—" "The bank called," Richard hissed, glancing nervously at the gathered neighbors. "About the reserve fund investments." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "What investments?" "Nothing that concerns you," Diane snapped, but Richard was already pulling her toward their car, whispering frantically. As they drove away, Frank Miller walked up to Margaret. "I think we should call an emergency community meeting. A real one." By 4 o'clock, the clubhouse was filled beyond capacity. Residents spilled onto the patio, windows open so everyone could hear. Frank stood at the front, explaining the legal implications of what they discovered. "Based on our review of the HOA financial records, which we legally obtained through proper channels, it appears that approximately $237,000 from our reserve fund was diverted into what the board documents call alternative investments." Gasps rippled through the crowd. These investments coincide with the founding dates of 3 LLCs, all registered to Richard Winter's business address. At the back of the room, Diane burst in, face flushed. "This is slander. You have no authority to access those records." "Actually," said Eleanor Jenkins, who had served as HOA treasurer before Diane replaced her, "all homeowners have legal rights to financial documentation. We simply exercised ours." "You don't understand the complexity of modern association management," Diane insisted, voice rising. "Sometimes funds need to be leveraged strategically for community benefit." "Is that what you call renovating your kitchen with Carrara marble?" asked Tom Garcia, pulling up photos on the projector screen. Because the same contractor who did your renovation last year billed the HOA $42,000 for clubhouse repairs that mysteriously never happened. Diane's composure finally shattered. You ungrateful people have no idea what it takes to keep property values rising. Everything I've done has been for the good of Oak Ridge. Including having Margaret's pool removal stopped, Frank asked quietly. Especially that, Diane's voice cracked. Her house is in pre-listing. A dismantled pool would create an eyesore right when the Jenkins family is showing their home next door. Do you know what comparable sales do for all our property values? The room fell silent as Diane realized what she'd admitted. 3 days after what Oak Ridge residents were now calling the overthrow, Margaret stepped out onto her back patio with her morning coffee. The partially dismantled pool sat where she'd left it before the chaos began. She had no time to finish removing it, caught up in the whirlwind of community meetings and the beginnings of the financial investigation. Her phone chimed with a text from Eleanor. Forensic accountant found something. Meeting at my house in 30 minutes. When Margaret arrived, she found the small group already gathered in Eleanor's dining room. Frank, Jason, Tom, and a sharp-eyed woman with a laptop who was introduced as Vivian Drake Suge. I'll keep this brief, Vivian said, opening her computer. I traced most of the misappropriated funds. Approximately $237,000 was diverted from your reserve account over 18 months, distributed across 3 LOCs registered to Richard Winters. We knew that much, Frank noted. What you didn't know, Vivian continued, is where that money eventually landed. These weren't just random investments. The funds were used to purchase 4 properties in Oak Ridge Estates when they went into foreclosure. Margaret leaned forward. Properties here, in our neighborhood. Yes. Through a labyrinth of shell companies, all ultimately controlled by the Winters, they were essentially using your AO funds to build a real estate portfolio. Jason frowned, but why? That seems incredibly risky for relatively small returns. Vivian smiled thinly. That's where it gets interesting. I found permit applications filed with the county. These 4 properties form a contiguous lot on the north side of the neighborhood. Together, they create a 3-acre parcel. The old Peterson Place, the foreclosed duplex, and those 2 properties that have been sitting empty, Tom realized aloud. Exactly. And there's a preliminary development agreement with Midtown Commercial Properties to build a small strip mall once the lots are combined. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were planning to commercialize part of our residential neighborhood, Margaret finally asked. While simultaneously using AHOA funds to do it, Vivian confirmed. The real profit would come from the commercial development, not the property values Diane was always ranting about. That explains why Diane was so obsessed with property values and curb appeal, Eleanor said. It wasn't about our homes. It was about making the neighborhood attractive to commercial investors. Frank rubbed his forehead. This is far worse than we thought. It's not just embezzlement. It's a commercial real estate scheme using our money. What do we do now? Margaret asked. We've already frozen the accounts, Eleanor replied. But we need to decide whether to pursue criminal charges. The doorbell rang. Eleanor checked her security camera feed and raised her eyebrows, speaking of the devil. She opened the door to find Diane standing there all alone without her usual clipboard or confident posture. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. May I come in? She asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside. When Diane entered the dining room, she faltered slightly at the sight of the assembled group and the forensic accountant's screen displaying flowcharts of money movement. I see you've been busy, she said, attempting to sound casual but failing. What do you want, Diane? Margaret asked directly. Diane took a deep breath. Richard has left town. He emptied our joint accounts yesterday and disappeared. He's not answering my calls. No one spoke. No one offered sympathy. I came to, Diane struggled with the words, to offer information in exchange for leniency. What kind of information? Frank asked cautiously. The commercial deal is bigger than you think. It involves 3 county officials and a zoning commission member. I have documentation. Richard didn't think I knew about his private email account, but I've been keeping copies of everything for months. I knew he would throw me under the bus eventually. Why would you help us now? Margaret asked. Diane's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled completely. Because I have nowhere else to go, and because while I may have bent rules and been difficult, I never intended for our community to be turned into a shopping center. That was all Richard and his developer friends. The room remained silent as everyone processed this unexpected turn. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Diane added. Just a chance to make things right. Eleanor's dining room remained silent for a long moment after Diane's unexpected offer. Margaret studied the woman who had terrorized the neighborhood for years, now standing before them looking defeated, makeup-free, and genuinely vulnerable for perhaps the first time. Why should we believe anything you say? Jason finally asked. You manipulated this community for years. Diane nodded slowly. You shouldn't trust me. That's why I brought proof. She pulled a USB drive from her purse and placed it on the table. Every email, every contract, every conversation Richard had with the developers and county officials, including recordings of meetings I wasn't supposed to attend. Frank eyed the drive suspiciously. What exactly do you want in return? I want to stay in my home, Diane said simply, and I'll accept whatever financial penalties are deemed appropriate short of bankruptcy. But I don't want to go to jail. Vivian, the forensic accountant, spoke up. Without her testimony, proving criminal intent rather than just mismanagement could be challenging. With it, you'd have a much stronger case against the primary perpetrators. I need to be clear, Diane continued, her voice steadier now. I'm not claiming innocence. I enforced ridiculous rules. I played favorites. I even knew Richard was using the reserve fund for investments, though he convinced me they were legitimate. She looked directly at Margaret. And yes, I called the police on you because your pool removal threatened the showing next door, which would have affected our property values, which in turn would have jeopardized the commercial deal Richard was orchestrating. The deal you supposedly knew nothing about, Margaret questioned. I knew he was doing something with those properties. I didn't know it was a commercial development until last month. By then, I was already in too deep. Diane's hands trembled slightly. When I confronted him about it, he reminded me that my signature was on most of the HOA documents. He said I'd go down harder than he would if it all came out. Tom crossed his arms. So now you're turning on him to save yourself. Yes, Diane admitted without hesitation. Wouldn't you? Eleanor exchanged glances with Frank, who gave a subtle nod. We'll need to verify everything on this drive before making any decisions, she told Diane. And we'll need a formal written statement from you. I've already prepared one. Diane pulled an envelope from her purse. It's all there. 26 pages detailing everything I know. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. You really were always prepared, weren't you? A ghost of a smile touched Diane's lips. Organization was never my problem. Morality, perhaps. 2 weeks later, the Oak Ridge community gathered again in the clubhouse. The room was somber as Eleanor and the interim board presented their findings and recommendations. Based on the evidence provided by Diane Winters and verified through our investigation, Eleanor announced, we've worked with legal counsel to reach several conclusions. First, we will be filing formal complaints with the district attorney's office against Richard Winters and 3 other individuals involved in the commercial development scheme. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Second, regarding Diane Winters, after much deliberation and in exchange for her cooperation, we've agreed not to pursue criminal charges against her specifically. However, she will be required to pay restitution of $42,000 for documented HOA funds used for personal expenses. Some residents nodded in approval, others frowned in disapproval. Additionally, Eleanor continued, the 4 properties acquired through misappropriated funds will be sold, with proceeds returning to our reserve account. Our attorneys believe we have a strong case for voiding these transactions. Margaret sat quietly in the middle of the room. She'd been asked to join the new board but had declined, preferring to remain simply a neighbor. Her house was still on the market, though she had second thoughts about leaving now that Oak Ridge was transforming. As the meeting progressed to discussions about new bylaws, Margaret glanced toward the back of the room, where Diane sat alone in the corner. Their eyes met briefly. Diane gave a small, acknowledging nod before looking away. The woman who had once ruled Oak Ridge with an iron clipboard was now just another resident stripped of power, but granted a chance at redemption few believed she deserved. 3 months after the overthrow, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed. The community bulletin board, once plastered with violation notices and stern warnings, now featured neighborhood events, babysitting offers, and sign-up sheets for the newly formed community garden. The interim board had become permanent, with Eleanor Jenkins officially elected as president by an overwhelming majority. Margaret stood in her backyard, surveying the smooth patch of grass where her pool had once stood. She decided to stay in Oak Ridge after all, withdrawing her house from the market after receiving a surprising job offer to manage a nearby nature preserve, a perfect match for her environmental science background. Looks good, came a voice from over the fence. It was Helen from across the street, watering her newly planted wildflowers, a garden feature that would have earned multiple violations under Diane's reign. Thanks, Margaret replied. The kids are lobbying to replace it with a trampoline, which they can now have without filing a 17-page application, Helen laughed. As they chatted, Margaret noticed an unfamiliar car pulling into Diane's driveway. Diane emerged from her house, greeting the visitors, a young couple with a toddler. They spoke briefly before Diane led them inside. Potential buyers, Helen explained, following Margaret's gaze. She's finally selling. Part of her restitution agreement, I heard. Margaret nodded. After the scandal broke, Diane had kept to herself, rarely seen except for occasional grocery runs or meetings with lawyers. The civil case against Richard was progressing, though he remained missing. The district attorney had filed charges against the corrupt county officials, creating a local political earthquake that had made regional headlines. Later that afternoon, Margaret was planting new shrubs when a shadow fell across her garden. She looked up to find Diane standing awkwardly at the edge of her yard. "Your garden looks nice," Diane said stiffly, clearly uncomfortable. Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Thanks. Did your house showing go well?" Diane seemed surprised by the civil question. "I think so. Young family from Westridge. The husband works from home and liked the office space." An awkward silence stretched between them. Two women who had been fierce adversaries now attempting basic neighborly conversation. "I heard you're staying," Diane finally said. "I assumed you'd be the first to leave." "I thought about it, but it turns out I like this neighborhood more than I realized." Margaret gestured toward her garden. "Especially now that I can plant whatever I want without getting a citation." The ghost of a smile crossed Diane's face. The purple hydrangeas would have been a violation under Section 12.4, non-approved ornamental varieties. "Along with my wind chimes, porch swing, and mailbox color," Margaret agreed. Diane looked down at her hands. "I came to say I'm sorry. Not just the generic apology I gave at the meeting, but specifically to you. I targeted you unfairly." Margaret studied the woman before her. Diane had lost weight, and her previously immaculate appearance had given way to simpler clothing and less perfect hair. The clipboard was nowhere to be seen. "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked. "Even before Richard's development scheme. You seem to enjoy making everyone miserable." Diane considered the question carefully. "Control, I suppose. We moved here after I lost my executive position during a corporate merger. Richard was struggling with his business. I felt powerless." She paused. "The HOA was something I could control, and it escalated." "That's actually the most honest thing I've ever heard you say," Margaret observed. "Therapy twice a week," Diane replied with a hint of self-deprecation. "Part of my personal rehabilitation plan." From down the street came the sounds of children laughing as neighbors gathered for an impromptu barbecue at the Garcia's house, another event that would have violated noise ordinances under the previous regime. "They're celebrating the new playground approval," Diane noted. "I saw the permit notice." "You're welcome to come," Margaret said, surprising herself with the invitation. "Most people don't bite, despite what you might think." Diane shook her head. "I'm not ready for that, but thank you." She turned to leave and paused. "Your fence is 2 inches higher on the west side, by the way. Just thought you should know." As Diane walked away, and Margaret wasn't sure if that had been a joke or a relapse into old habits. Either way, she found herself smiling as she returned to her gardening.